I'm Sarah Wilson, and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Budcast. This episode is going to be split into at least two parts, because when I started writing notes for this episode, I couldn't stop, so it's gone on slightly longer than I anticipated. And it is a bit ranty in places and hopefully not too preachy in others. What I want to say before I start is that I am guilty of all the things I talk about, and I'm not judging anyone who's done the same because I'm here in my glass house with no stones in my pocket. And I suppose I frightened myself a bit when I thought about this topic, and this episode is my attempt to document my feelings so I don't forget how important these things are, and also so that anyone that happens to come across this episode in the future will hopefully stop and think for a minute or two. So I listened to two audiobooks this week, both about how humans can and do impact upon ecosystems. The first was Bringing Nature Home by Douglas W Tallamy, and the second was Darwin Comes to Town, and I'm going to butcher this name, so I'm sorry, but it was by Menno Schultz-Wiesen. Although I loved Bringing Nature Home, I actually read Darwin Comes to Town as an antidote to it. I kind of hoped it would provide some positives after Tallamy's book provoked in me real feelings of panic. The implications of what Tallamy writes are enormous, and they actually made my stomach drop, and I wanted to kind of shrink away from what he says and almost cover my mouth with my hands. And that probably sounds really dramatic, but this was my honest reaction the further I went into the book and the more the message that he's conveying sunk in. So before I delve into both books, I'd like to add a caveat that many of the things I'm talking about here are problematic, or they need more research, or they're actually downright contentious. And I am pretty clueless about all things related to biology, so I do urge you to do your own research. And I will also carry out more research, and I'm going to endeavour to speak to as many experts as I can find who can sensibly weigh in on these topics. We probably all saw the recently published figures about the decline in populations of the world's insects. And if you didn't, the headline is that 41% of all species are going into decline, and a third of those are going into extinction. And Tallamy argues in his book that the replacement of native plants with non-natives is what's leading to habitat loss and a reduction in biodiversity. And his point is that as humans, we always think if we remove a bit of habitat, the wildlife will move elsewhere. And the problem is there is no elsewhere anymore. And biodiversity is directly linked to the size of an area. So he says that new species come about faster in large areas, and the rate at which species go extinct is slower. So the risk is spread across a wider area, and there's built-in resilience. And when habitats are fragmented, extinction occurs, and the number of species that will survive human habitat disruption can be expressed as a percentage of the habitat we leave undisturbed. So if we took 50% of the land, we'd end up with 50% of the original species. If we took 80%, there'd be 20% of the species left. And Tallamy is based in the US, and he writes that not one part of the US remains undisturbed by human activity. And we may think here in the UK we should be okay because we've got our ancient woodlands. But he also states that since A.A. Milne wrote Winnie the Pooh in Ashdown Forest, we've actually lost 47 plant species from the forest. So you're probably already seeing the implications of this human disturbance on our wild landscapes and why it's so frightening. So Tallamy talks about native versus non-native or alien plant species, and even this subject is not cut and dried. We often talk about naturalised species, and they are plants that are able to exist in the wild without human intervention and have been present in the natural landscape for a long time, usually centuries. And as an example, here in the UK, snowdrops are not a native plant, they're naturalised, with the first recorded sighting of the plant in the wild in 1778. And although we think of this as a long time, Tallamy cites the example of conifers in the Cupressaceae, Pinaceae and Taxaceae families that were introduced to Britain over 500 years ago. Yet in that time, of the 500 species of moth that are available to feed on them, only 50 of those moth species choose to do so, which suggests that even after they become part of the natural landscape, these non-natives are never as useful as their native counterparts as food sources. And Tallamy believes that in order to be classed as a native, a plant needs to be able to interact with its neighbours in an ecosystem in what he refers to as countless ways. So why does he believe that native insects won't eat non-native plants? Well, he thinks there are three reasons. Firstly, the plants we import as ornamentals are likely chosen for the very reason that they're resilient to pests. So they're not a random sample of the plants available. They've been actively sought out for their unpalatability. And secondly, there needs to be a long evolutionary period in order for insects to adapt to this specific chemical mix that signifies a particular plant. It's not that insects go around eating a bit of every leaf and then spitting it out if it's not suitable. They literally will not recognise certain plant materials as potential food sources, and therefore they won't even try them. And thirdly, most insects are specialists and will likely only be able to eat, or will try to eat, the species they've evolved in tandem with. And in episode 16 of the podcast, which was Poisonous Plants with Dr. Liz Dauncey, we talked about the toxicity of plants and the different chemicals that are present in plant parts that can affect the taste, the digestibility and the toxicity. Particularly, we discussed it in relation to humans. So go and have a listen to that if you'd like to find out more. And an important figure to bear in mind going forward is that 90% of insects are thought to be specialists. That means that they're adapted to use, say, one particular plant species as a food source. So with ragwort, you get one species that feeds on it, one specialist, and that's the cinnabar moth larvae. So let's talk about these specialist insects that make up 90% of the insect population and the 10% that are generalists. What's caught me out in the past is thinking that because there are bees on my cephalaria and butterflies on my buddleia, everything must be tickety-boo in my garden, right? Well, it seems that it's not that straightforward. And here's where it gets a little bit sciencey and cleverer people than me start to have differences of opinion. There's a book written by Dr. Jennifer Owens called Wildlife of a Garden, in which she published the results of her 30-year study of the plants and wildlife in her Leicester garden. And in the 2010 foreword, Chris Packham writes that we need to rethink our preoccupation with the value of native species as invertebrate food plants, because in Dr. Owens' garden, one species of caterpillar fed on 12 native plants, but 42 alien species. Now, he doesn't state it explicitly, but it's pretty safe to assume that this particular species he's talking about is a generalist and not a specialist, which, as we'll see, comes with its own problems, according to Douglas Tallamy. So how about these non-native plants versus the natives? The RHS released the following press release on Tuesday, the 11th of August 2015, and it was widely reported in all the usual gardening and national press and media outlets. And they said, new Royal Horticultural Society research identifies that a mix of plants from around the world may be the most effective way to sustain pollinators. Research reveals a mixture of native and non-native ornamental plants may provide the best resources for pollinating insects in gardens. Native plants are not always the first choice for pollinators visiting gardens, and non-native plants can prolong the flowering season, providing an additional food source. So if you go and read the research these bullets were taken from, which is the 4-year RHS research project called Plants for Bugs, you'll see these headlines came from the research paper that was done on pollinators, which was part 1 of the research project. And as I say, these headlines were pretty well published, and they were nicely supporting a campaign that the RHS continues to run, which is called Plants for Pollinators, where they sell a range of plants that are designed to benefit pollinating insects. Of course, these are pretty flowering plants that are easy to flog in garden centres, and especially when they've got that eye-catching Plants for Pollinators plastic tag stuck in them. Now, if there's someone out there listening with more brain cells than I have left, which is probably almost all of you, perhaps you might like to have a look through the full paper, the RHS paper, which is available online on their website. And let me know if you can see how those bullet points were arrived at based on the evidence presented in part 1 of their study. Because, as I say, I'm not the sharpest tool in the box, but I thought that the conclusions seemed a little bit different from what the actual findings were, but that could just be me. So moving on, I don't remember part 2 of the study being as widely reported in the media, but admittedly, I'm not one for gardening magazines or newspapers or watching much telly. So please get in touch if I'm wrong and you do remember these results being shouted about. But part 2 of the research, which studied plant-dwelling invertebrates, concluded that, Findings on the abundance of invertebrates that are found on the plants, including those feeding on living plant material, on decomposing organic matter, and on other invertebrates, was published in Biodiversity and Conservation. The findings were that, number one, you need to plant a predominance of plants native to the UK. Number two, planting schemes that are based on plants originating from the Northern Hemisphere, in brackets near natives, may support only marginally fewer, less than 10% invertebrates in some functional groups, including herbivores and some predators, than UK native plant schemes. Plant schemes based on Southern Hemisphere, in brackets exotic plants, will still support a good number of invertebrates, albeit around 20% fewer than plants from the UK. Regardless of plant origin, the more densely a plant scheme is planted or allowed to grow, the more invertebrates of all kinds, herbivores, predators, detritivores and omnivores it will support. So, interestingly, the RHS quotes the raison d'etre behind its Plants for Pollinators campaign as, this is a quote, using scientific evidence, our extensive experience and the records of gardeners and beekeepers, we've handpicked a selection of year-round flowering plants for pollinators to tackle the decline in pollinator numbers. So, in view of the release of part 2 of the Plants for Bugs research, I'm really looking forward to the imminent launch of the RHS's plant range, which is going to be called Plants to be Shredded by Caterpillars. So it's not just the RHS research that concluded native plants make incomparably better host species for native insects than non-natives. You can find lots of research out there to support this, but as Chris Packham wrote in his foreword to Dr. Owen's book, generalists seem happy enough to feed on non-natives, so can't we just allow the generalists to gradually outcompete and eventually replace those fussy specialists? And Tallamy actually addresses this question in his book, and the answer is a definite no. So he carried out a field study where comparing the diversity and biomass of insects on the 4 most common natives and the 4 most common non-native plant species on a particular site. He found there were 4 times more herbivore biomass on natives and that they supported 3.2 times as many herbivore species. Most importantly, the 2 types of natives that make up the majority of bird diets were supported to the tune of 35 times more on native species. So although you may think I've been banging on about insects without seeming to care about other species, obviously bird populations will be adversely affected when their insect food supplies are low. And even more interestingly, he also found that native plants produced twice as much biomass as non-natives, biomass being the quantity of insects that visited the site. So he found that even though the generalists are eating the non-natives, they can't benefit from them at the same rate as they can benefit from natives. So I think what was lacking in the study of Dr. Owen's garden in Leicester was actually a plot next door, planted entirely with native plants that was studied in parallel. And if we'd had that, I think it might have put the results of her study somewhat in the shade. So as a further nail in the coffin of native versus non-native habitats, Tallamy also cites a 2005 study by John D. Lloyd and Thomas E. Martin, which looked at the reproductive success of a particular bird species in a native versus an exotic grassland, and concluded that, quote, the odds of a nest surviving a given day were 17% lower in the exotic habitat, and that nestlings grew more slowly and had a smaller final mass in the exotic habitat, end quote. So interestingly, despite having lower reproductive success in the exotic habitat, the researchers found no evidence that the studied species, which was the chestnut-collared longspur, preferred to nest in the native habitat, suggesting that animals who are feeding on the insects, which feed on the plants, can't recognise a difference between the native and non-native habitats. They just see what they think is a viable habitat. They don't always know best and make informed choices regarding their long-term survival. So I think, therefore, we as observers need to understand that sometimes our intervention may be necessary, and that sometimes what looks like an outwardly thriving population of a species may not be doing quite so well when you look beneath the surface. And before you think it's fine, your garden birds are okay because you put food out all year round, It's not, because at certain times of the year, such as when they have nestlings, some birds that are happy to eat seeds the rest of the time will need to be feeding insects to their young, for example. So there's no getting around this need for invertebrates, however much we try and prop up the system. So that's the end of part 1. I hope I haven't depressed you too much, or maybe I do, because perhaps we all need to think about the implications of what we do in our gardens, or things won't really change. Please do join me for the next podcast when I'll be talking about the other book, Darwin Comes to Town, and exploring the idea that maybe things aren't as bad as we think. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next Tuesday.